Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Midsemester Reset, brought to you by the Academic Resource Center at Georgetown University. Today, we are going to be taking a look at some strategies you can use to check in with where you are in the middle of the semester, especially if you feel like you're behind, overwhelmed, and just need to hit that reset button and kind of start over with your next set of midterms from a fresh perspective. We are going to start by looking at a really handy tool. This is the time management calculator from the University of Pittsburgh, which is a great online resource that can give you a visual sense of how you are actually spending your time. So with this time management calculator, we can go down and put in how much time we're spending on all of our normal activities. We have 168 hours in a week. That's how much time we have. It can feel like more than that, honestly, but it's finite and there's only so much time we can have to work on everything. So I've gone through, I've put in how much time I've spent with a part-time job, eating, commuting, which is walking across campus, sleeping, uh, socializing. I've put in everything except for my classes. What I love about this tool is that based on how many credits you're taking, it can tell you how much time you should spend studying. So here's what my week looks like without all of my studying and class time in here. If I'm taking a normal student course load, which is 15 credits, this calculator calculates that I should be spending 45 hours a week studying. So that's filling up my week perfectly based on that. That's more time than I have sleeping on here. It's more time than I have anything else. So that's definitely rounding up, but this can be a really good tool for telling how much time you're actually spending studying and how much time is lost in procrastinating. The way that this calculator has put these particular study hours together is based on the idea that you should be spending 2 to 3 hours of time outside of class studying and doing homework per credit hour. So for this particular calculator, it adds on 3 hours per class, and it may vary class to class. For an easier course, you might be spending honestly 1 hour of time, and that might be normal. You may have a much more aggressive class where you're spending 5 hours a week. In general, though, it's important to think of how close to or how far from this particular number you are with completing work. If you're spending significantly more time than 3 hours per credit, then you may be taking time away from your physical and emotional well-being, and it may mean that there are other personal needs that are not being met. If you are spending a significantly lower amount of time, then potentially that means that you are prioritizing social or club responsibilities much more over academic than you should be, or it may just mean that you're spending too much time procrastinating and not enough time actually getting work done. One of the great points about checking in with how you're working at this point in the semester is that you have the advantage of knowing how you've been working over the last several weeks. You have a sense of how your classes are operating, and you have a sense of how you are operating within your particular schedule. And that's a valuable tool that can really help you be more effective moving forward. A good step is to look at how you've spent the last few weeks in order to plan how you'll spend the next few weeks. In planning out your study schedule, the best resource you have to determine that is how you have actually been studying, what you've been doing well, and what has maybe not been so successful. In considering the last month, there are a few things in particular that you should focus on and some guiding questions that can help you develop a better study schedule. First, what are the time blocks when you are consistently the most productive? Looking over the last month, are there trends in terms of times when you've sat down and gotten work done in a more productive way? Maybe it's still not your ideal level of productivity, but what have been the most successful study blocks? In identifying those time blocks, ask yourself if you are consistently the most productive during the same times of day. Why or why not? Is it that you're focusing better in the morning because you aren't tired? Is it that you are focusing better right after you have class because you're mentally already thinking about materials? But look at those times and ask yourself what makes those times more successful. Likewise, you also want to ask yourself, when are the time blocks when you consistently tried to do work but ended up procrastinating? This means looking at those times when you sat down, you wanted to work, and it just didn't happen. And likewise, asking yourself, what factor is the primary contributor to not being able to push through and work during those times? Once again, is it that you're tired? Is it that you're with friends and you're not able to focus on your work? Is it that you're trying to work before class or in between classes, but you're so distracted by needing to be somewhere you can't actually commit to it? Figuring out the why behind those lags is going to help you figure out when are the better times for you to commit to working. With that in mind, identify which hours during the week you can most effectively complete work and work on your biggest academic priorities during that time. This may seem fairly obvious, but the goal of figuring out when you work best is so that you can plan on working on what is most important during those times when you work best. And while this is obvious, this isn't always how students approach the week. Instead, students approach the week with this idea that they need to be working consistently always, but the reality is they aren't consistently working. So that leads to the sense of burnout of just pushing and pushing and pushing without actually having results to show for that. With that in mind, you also want to pinpoint when you most frequently procrastinate and plan on working on non-academics during those times. Identify the time blocks when you are least likely to commit to getting work done. Those times when regularly you sit down to work and you do not work, and instead actively plan for some of the tasks that maybe aren't getting done or that are getting done but that aren't being planned at a certain time. This could mean when you're going to do your dishes or when you're going to do your laundry. This could mean when you're going to exercise. This could mean when you're going to hang out with friends or call your family. But if you are regularly sitting down at 9 o'clock to work until 11 and you consistently do nothing during that time, it would be better to use that time to do some yoga and take a shower than it would be to stare at your laptop and just increase the mental burnout that occurs with forcing yourself to work when you don't have the capacity to work. We've been talking about using the best working blocks for you and using those best working blocks to focus on the most important assignments, that leads us into our next step of how can you prioritize the most important aspect of each class? There are two major questions to consider in determining these priorities. The first, which assignments have the biggest impact on your grade? That means looking at your syllabus, what are the assignments that are really going to affect your overall results in this class? The second question is which assignments have the biggest impact on your comprehension of the material? That means out of all of the assignments that you're given, which ones really help you understand information and really help you feel like you're learning? With that in mind, you want to intentionally dedicate the most time to the assignments that answer those questions. And the other side of that is that you want to limit the time that you are spending on other assignments. This doesn't mean you're ignoring the assignments that are a lower priority, but you want to limit your time on those instead of trying to be a perfectionist and complete them with the same intentionality that you might the high priority items. So, as I mentioned before, the goal should be to focus on your top priorities when you work best. One of the simplest changes you can make is to, when you sit down with a work block, when your focus is high, don't begin by working on the assignment that is due next. Instead, work on the assignment that is the highest priority for you. A good example of what I mean by this is how if you have a paper due in 2 weeks, you may have the intention of beginning it 2 weeks early, but often we sit down to do work and we work on our homework for the next class first and tell ourselves that we'll work on the paper after we finished our reading. But then the reality is we're so tired by the time we finish that reading that we no longer have the energy to work on the paper. Since it's not a high priority at this point in time, because it's not due for 2 weeks, we end up saying, oh, I'll do it tomorrow. But then we repeat the same routine that day and again and again. A way to combat this is start that study block by working on the paper. It doesn't mean you're sitting down to write an entire paper. It just means that you're going to spend a small block of time on this priority so that it isn't completely ignored. It might be honestly as little as 10 minutes, maybe no more than a half hour, but making a little bit of time to work on something that is high priority before you move into the lower priority but more pressing assignment can actually ensure that you're making progress. An important note I've put here is that everything cannot be the most important thing. And as students, often you may determine the most important thing to be the most urgent thing. That doesn't mean what's urgent isn't important, but it might not be the most important. And kind of working your way into determining how to balance most urgent versus most important is a skill that takes time to develop, but is something that's helpful to develop for students. So as I mentioned, you want to limit how much time you spend on low priority items. Instead of focusing on these tasks until they're finished, aim to spend a certain amount of time on them. Especially Georgetown students, often you may approach every single homework assignment from a completionist or a perfectionist perspective. You aim to sit down with a reading, fully understand it, really commit to it. And that is admirable and often can be done. But if you spend so much time on that that it means that you're not getting to a paper, then that means that there needs to be some balance in how you're working through these two assignments side by side. What that means is that you should give yourself a block of time to work on it and maybe give yourself a check-in point for how you're working through your low priority goals so that you can see, okay, I'm approaching this reading or this assignment with a certain level of attention, but am I going to get through this goal in the time I've given myself? If the answer is no, that check-in can be a time to maybe change how you're approaching it and instead maybe approach the assignment with a less thorough methodology. I have an example we're going to take a look at. For econ, let's say I have 3 assignments on my radar. We'll say it is Sunday night. I have a reading due the next day. I have a problem set due in 3 days, so on Wednesday, and I have a test in 1 week. So I have a test next Monday. First, I need to figure out what is my highest priority. The test is my highest priority because it has a large impact on my final grade. It's a big test. This is important. My second priority is the problem set. And that's because it is the best tool in learning the material. So in terms of learning, this is what's going to help me understand the information the most. And with that in mind, it contributes to my overall understanding of the material the best. This also will have more impact on my grade than the reading, but less than the test. And then my lowest priority item here is the reading. This has the lowest impact on my grade and the lowest impact on my learning, but it's still important and it is the most urgent because it will help me in tomorrow's class session. So what's interesting about this example is that the highest priority is also the least urgent, and my lowest priority is the highest urgency. So what I have here is my typical approach to this work. If I have a 3-hour homework block on Sunday, what I would typically do is finish my reading until it's completed. So that might be about an hour and a half. And then I might spend the remaining time on my problem set, which would also be about an hour and a half. And with that, I would not spend any time on studying. So I've gotten a lot of good work done here, but I'm not working on my highest priority item. A way to shift this is for my 3-hour homework block, start by reviewing terms for my test for 30 minutes. This is a small block of time. This isn't going to honestly alter my study schedule that much, but it's going to make sure I'm thinking about this high priority item. After that, I'm going to work on my reading at a normal pace for about 30 minutes. That means I'm going to sit down. I'm not going to think about how I'm approaching it. I'm going to be as in-depth or thorough as I want. But after 30 minutes, and I would set a timer for this, I will take a look at how far I've gotten in the reading and how much I have left to complete, because my goal for this reading is to not spend more than an hour on it. So for the next 30 minutes, what I would do is look over the reading for major ideas and maybe not approach it in as detail-oriented a manner. What that gives me is ultimately at the end of this study block, I would still have about an hour and a half to spend on the problem set. So these changes are minor, but they're just helping me be more intentional and making sure I'm giving some mindful time to that high priority test. This methodology can also apply to non-academics. So what I mean by that is you should also be using the same method of prioritizing to health, your social life, and to clubs and internships. When it comes to health, determine your minimum needs compared to your ideal needs and commit to meeting that minimum. What I mean by that is, for example, thinking about sleep. How much sleep do you function the best on? It could be something like 9 hours, 10 hours, might be a big number. And what's your minimum that you really need to function well? It might be 7, which is still cutting it short for you, but that's what you really need. And then you need to make a commitment to yourself to stick to that minimum. You can't always breach the ideal, but if you cut back on that minimum, then ultimately everything else is going to be more difficult. For social, determine how much time you need to be social in order to maintain a healthy balance. So determine separate from what your schedule looks like this week or next week, determine how many hours a week you need to feel like you are remaining connected to the people in your life while also making sure you're taking care of your emotional and mental well-being. With that minimum, it may vary week to week. Maybe you have one weekend where you have a lot going on, and maybe you have a week where you have nothing going on socially. But make sure you try not to go over that limit too much. And if you are, take a look at what are the top priority social items and what is maybe something that you can push to a future week, even if you can't necessarily prioritize it right now. And clubs and internships might be the most straightforward to prioritize. If you're spending more than a reasonable amount of time on clubs and internships, take a look at how that's impacting your ability to keep up with your academics and think about, is there a way you can cut back in one club, or is there a way that you can put more focus on a certain club or internship and maybe cut down your involvement in another organization? A final question that I want to check in on: should I try to catch up? This is a question I often hear from students around this time of year because often when someone gets behind for one class session or a second class session, it feels feasible to go back and do those readings, do that homework. But once you become behind for a week or 2 weeks, then it starts to feel unmanageable. Balancing assignments due in the future with assignments that are overdue is challenging, and it's unrealistic to catch up on a significant amount of work when you're also trying to work ahead. You want to be mindful of a bad pattern of not working on what's due in the next week because you're trying to finish up something that was due 2 weeks ago. When it comes to assignments that are already incomplete, you need to avoid being a perfectionist. Sometimes you have gotten behind in a class in the first place because you're approaching it with that perfectionism mindset. And that is what keeps you from working on it at all. The more overdue something is, the more you need to focus on getting it finished rather than making it perfect. My recommendations for written assignments or graded assignments that are overdue is to check in with your professor to determine what they expect to be completed. If you are, for example, in a Spanish class and maybe you haven't turned in 4 worksheets and you also haven't turned in an essay, meet with your professor, ask them when do they need this content filled in? When do they need the worksheets versus the essay? For an example like that, the essay might be a priority, but the worksheet may not be. It's better to check in with your professor to help determine a plan than to let the work continue to pile up. For reading, something where there isn't necessarily an assessment component, carve out time once a week to make sure you are working on looking over those materials in a holistic, big picture way. If you are behind on, let's say you have 7 readings for your theology class that you haven't read, instead of delaying doing your next 3 readings to finish those, keep up with your readings for this week, and then maybe Saturday morning, sit down for an hour and look at 1 reading or give a more holistic look at 2 readings. Just work on looking over them again in a non-perfectionist way, little by little, but don't derail your future academics to catch up on those. So the question in the chat, what are some more realistic goals that we can set for ourselves, especially when you are behind, but still want to get a good understanding and good grade? What would be helpful, I think, is it's going to vary class by class, obviously. So there's not one size fits all sort of approach. But I would say for looking at class materials that you're behind on, going through and trying to pick out what is the main idea that's important about this and making a list of what are the top 3 things, techniques, pieces of information I need to know from this. So what I mean is, let's go back to that Spanish class example. If you are behind for maybe 4 lectures and 4 textbook readings, instead of sitting down and trying to read all 4 readings in one sitting and then rewatch all 4 lectures, I would start by sitting down with 1 chapter, maybe looking at the beginning of the chapter, what are the learning objectives? At the end of the chapter, are there any review questions? And maybe also checking the syllabus to see if there's some kind of title or heading or on your Canvas page. Looking for that identifier of what's the goal of this class. So it might be something like learning the subjunctive. It might be something like travel terms, something like that, but figuring out what that big picture idea is, especially for more subjective classes like theology or literature, that's going to help you understand how this class fits into the bigger narrative of your overall class. And then based on that, what you want to do is, knowing that's your main goal, figure out again, what are the top 3 things that you need to focus on? So for the Spanish example, you might have a set of vocab terms and then also a lot of grammar rules. But if this chapter in this class is on learning the subjunctive, that means your priority should be figuring out that grammatical structure. It doesn't mean that you should ignore the vocab completely, but it means that where you're committing your time is to learning that one main idea that commits to that overall narrative. So I guess a better way to rephrase this recommendation is instead of approaching the work you're behind on by trying to absorb all of the details, instead approach the work that you're behind on by looking at the main idea and again, trying to figure out and connect with that one major component, the main learning objective. That can be harder for something like calculus or biology, but it's still going to help you focus your efforts. That's going to be especially important for this question of getting a good understanding. Um, and then with the other details, once you feel like you're kind of back on track, you can go back and work on the vocabulary, the other details, but that will fit in better if you can understand the main idea. So the next question, sometimes when I plan ahead, I end up doing something different or plans change. This is true. That's life. How can you make sure you leave enough flow to harness the energy of the day while still getting things done? Which is, again, it's complicated, right? We're all humans and we all have energy dips. One thing that I find really helpful is to get in the habit of writing out those top priority tasks and figure out throughout this webinar, I've talked about sort of what's your minimum and what's your maximum. Have a sense of what's like the one big thing I need to get done each day. So each day you should have at least one big thing that's your minimum that you're getting done. And then also have your maximum. So there's the ideal, right? You want to get done everything every day, especially as a Georgetown student, you're probably quite ambitious. But knowing that one like must do. This is sort of based off of the principle of an app I'll mention, but it used to be my favorite, but the interface has kind of changed, and it's not as useful as it used to be. But I've still learned a lot from their approach. Rocket 135 is a really simple task management to-do list where for each day it asks you what's one big thing you need to get done, 3 medium things, and 5 little things. And trying to balance the big task with the little tasks, but making sure at the end of either at the end of each day or at the beginning of the next day, checking in with what you did and didn't do that day, and making sure to prioritize one thing you didn't get done the day before. So having flexibility in your to-do list means knowing again, what's the most important thing that needs to get done today. But it also part of that is sort of a general check-in, making sure you are regularly looking at what you need to do again at the beginning or the end of the day and constantly updating those to-dos based on the reality of what has happened or what hasn't happened. Something I'll name is that as you get in the habit of working on task lists or prioritizing, sometimes when you don't look at the work you need to do, the more time you spend away from it, the more stigma kind of becomes developed around an assignment. If you, for example, let's say you have a paper due, the longer that you don't look at the paper prompt, the more stressed out you become about it and the harder it becomes to look at the paper prompt. And the same can happen for just like a general to-do list. So the more often you're looking at these to-dos, the less frightening it becomes. Whereas if you are just kind of looking at your upcoming deadlines less frequently, it becomes a little scarier. Best of luck with everything in the coming week and enjoy the rest of your evening.